Okay, hello everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm going to get us started for the sake of time, and we will keep admitting people as they join our meeting today. But we're really excited to welcome Jen Zuckerman back to our webinar series to present on the second part of our well-received webinar, Examining Whiteness in the Food System, Part 1. We were not able to get through everything we wanted to get through last time, and people really wanted to hear more from Jen. So today we are going to do a brief overview of what we discussed last time, and then delve into all of the information that we did not get into. Please be aware that the first time Jen was with us, we did record it as we are today, and it is available on the Indiana Grown for Schools website webinar recordings page. I will drop the link in the chat if you want to access it now, but it is always publicly available on our website. So I highly encourage you guys to take a look at that. And I will upload this recording by the end of next week on the website. So you will be able to find part 1 and part 2. So Jen, I will hand it over to you and I will share my screen for you.
Great. Thank you so much, Megan. And it's so great to be back with everyone again. And for those of you who I wasn't on the Zoom with, I think it was in May, my name is Jen Zuckerman, and I am with the World Food Policy Center at Duke University. We're within the Sanford School of Public Policy. I've been here about 5 years. My background has also been in philanthropy. So I've worked with Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina Foundation and the Sustainable Ag and Food System Funders Network. And through all of that work, I've been deeply engaged, kind of been in the places and spaces that you are and that we currently are. And just the whole point of coming together to honestly write about white narratives in the food system didn't come from a place of like point fingers and say like, oh, we're horrible, this is what we're doing wrong, but really to come to an understanding of what we're doing. Because I mean, truly to the person, everyone that I have worked with and, well beyond folks that I have worked with are all, we're all in this work together. We're in this work together to really understand how we can create a healthier food system, how we can create a more equitable food system. And we're all here with this true intent to make an impact and to make a difference and make it collectively better for all of us. And there's some things that are standing in our way and have been standing in our way. So getting this understanding of what's been standing in our way is really kind of this background of, why we have delved into this research and what I'll be offering today. So next slide. What I'll be offering today is just a bit of review. So in that review, it's really important to touch on some key definitions again. And even if you were in the webinar the last time, it's helpful to hear these definitions again, because I think, a lot of these words and terms can feel confusing. They feel confusing to me, being in the work all of the time. And if you're kind of coming in and out of this work, they get confusing. And especially once you try to get into conversations with folks around them, it can start to get, a little off center. So our goal is to just dive into those definitions again, just from the sake of review. Again, we're going to we're not going to go into the history, but we're just going to speak about it again, because every time that I'm speaking about what's happening now and what needs to happen next, if we aren't aware of how we got here, then we can't really move forward in the right way. This time, we're going to spend a lot of time on the narratives and what's next. So we're going to go into 3 specific narratives and talk about how those showed up in the research, some examples of those. But then what's really important too, because as we figure out, okay, well, what are we doing? The goal is to then get an understanding of like, how might we do this differently? And there are examples. So I'll be going in depth into a kind of the theory behind the examples, but then some concrete examples of work that's happened at a state level here in North Carolina, as well as, an example of something that's happening at a federal level. I do have an assumption that, a lot of folks on this call might be operating under either state or federal funding, which means, there's a lot of restrictions in terms of what and how you can do things, but just knowing how things are moving at the federal level is also going to be very important. Next slide, please. So just again, as that review, the question that we dove into when we came up with these white narratives was to understand what we're doing. So what we're trying to do is understand how white supremacy culture narratives show up specifically in food insecurity and in food access work. And the way we did this, again, was a literature review to understand, well, what's the literature behind power, behind whiteness, behind white supremacy culture, and we'll talk about those a little bit. What's the literature behind that? And then we did interviews with food justice leaders nationally and subject matter experts on this work nationally to come up with the themes that cut across all of this. And those themes are what the white narratives ended up being. Next slide, please. So starting with this framing of whiteness, because this is all based in whiteness, and just to reiterate that whiteness is this ideology, again, and it's based on beliefs, values, behaviors, and attitudes. And what happens as a result of whiteness is this unequal distribution of power and privilege. So the theme of power and the theme of decision making will be throughout this entire presentation, both in terms of what we're doing in terms of those white narratives, as well as how might we do this differently, which is all about a power shift. So again, going back to what we're doing, we have to unlearn. We have to recognize what we've been socialized into and then relearn about both this history and how we might move forward differently. Next slide, please. So just to touch on a couple of these key terms and definitions. I'm not going to go through all of them that I went through the last time, but again, I'm going to highlight two systems and ideologies so that we get a framing for what this is, and we can also distinguish what we're talking about are systems in which all of us are operating, not issues of individual people. So next slide, please. So this, the term white supremacy culture, I know is, again, one that can create some pretty significant reactions and feelings for folks. And so anyone on the call who might be experiencing that, that is absolutely normal. So please, just sit in that. And just wanted to name that what white supremacy culture is this ideology that white people and their ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and actions are inherently superior to people of color. And this white supremacy culture is reproduced by all of the institutions in our society, and that these beliefs and actions and behaviors can be found anywhere here in the United States. So in any individual, in any group, in any organization. So working in and around white supremacy culture is not something that is specific only to white people or to white organizations. It is something that we are all working within. So this is a broad structure that we're all working within. Next slide, please. And kind of hand in hand with white supremacy culture is structural racism. And structural racism is historic, and it's also this normalization and this legitimization of these array of dynamics. And what happens as a result of structural racism is that whites are advantaged and people of color have cumulative and chronic adverse outcomes. And again, so I just want to think about things like the racial health gap, so racial health disparities that I'm sure most of you are dealing with, working in, as well as the racial wealth gap. And one thing that from the health perspective, we talk about the social determinants of health. But structural racism is something that really is a determinant of those determinants. And what structural racism does is it just reinforces these effects of these multiple institutions and norms so that it's constantly reproducing. It's always shifting and changing. And so there's no way to fully ever really understand all of it. But knowing that it exists and knowing how it exists and morphs is really important in terms of how we do our collective work together. Next slide, please. Another really key term, especially for all of the amazing work that you're all leading, is this difference between food desert and food apartheid. And what I'm going to focus on is food apartheid, because as we're thinking about power, as we're thinking about decision making, and as we're thinking about who is impacted and who is benefiting, food apartheid really looks at this whole food system as a part of a larger culture and recognizes that it's this history of policy, practice, and systems that have created the inequalities in our food system and who has access to what, as well as who has ownership of what. So we'll talk about that a little bit more, but I want us to keep ourselves framed in the concept of food apartheid, as opposed to, the common colloquialism of food desert as termed by the USDA, which somewhat acknowledges that this just happened and that it was normal and natural for there to be no access in these communities. Next slide, please. So those were kind of our definitions that I want us to be kind of clear on. I am going to open, make sure I can see the chat. So if you do have questions about any of those definitions or anything that you need clarity on, please drop something in the chat, and I'm glad to kind of circle back to that. The other thing I just want to reference again is that what we're working on today and what we're dealing with today is not something that just cropped up. What we're dealing with today is the result of a history of inequitable policy and practice that have happened, since since before the founding of the United States. So next slide, please. And what I talked about the last time, I went deep into the issues of land appropriation and deep into the issue of also the issue of housing segregation, what happens to really create these food apartheid areas. That's all also tied into what results in this racial wealth gap and access to capital. Here in the United States, you have to have land and you have to have some level of ownership to be able to access capital. So you have to have money to get money. And so this growing racial wealth gap is really key to this history of, how we're in the situation that we're in today. And then, there's a lot. I think I sent the link the last time on our food history of Durham, which truly can be essentially the food history of any community in the United States, that really talks through, even since before first contact with colonizers here in the US, how our food system, how policies and practices created the inequities that we're dealing with in our food system today. And I know I'm kind of brushing through things, but I really want to get into kind of the meat of what we didn't get into before. So I'm glad to resend that link and glad to resend information on history as we continue to move forward. Next slide, please. So what we didn't get to spend a lot of time on the last time we were together was to do this deep dive into the white supremacy culture narratives. So next slide, please. So I just want to go over this slide again, maybe just a little more slowly than I did the last time. So there's aspects of white supremacy culture. These aspects include individualism, paternalism, and neoliberalism. And those aren't all of the aspects of white supremacy culture, but those are the three from which the majority of these narratives stemmed from. And this graphic is really designed to show how issues of individualism, which is stressing the needs of the individual over the group, over the needs of the group of the whole, and that individuals should be able to just solve their own problems. Also paternalism, which involves interfering with an individual's or a community's ability to choose and make decisions. And then neoliberalism, which is really this policy model that emphasizes personal responsibility and hard work and essentially allows a free market economy to solve issues, which, if we go back to the idea that you have to have wealth to build wealth, if you're working in a market economy and you don't have wealth, you'll only continue to lose wealth on this scale as opposed to ever build wealth. So what all of these tie into are the narratives that showed up in the research. And the narratives that showed up are, if they only knew, which we spoke about last time, vote with your fork, which really implies that your consumption signals your values. Communities can't take care of themselves. Failure to listen, which really denies solutions from those directly impacted. Build it and they'll come, which we'll talk about a little more deeply today. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps, which really is rooted in this belief of meritocracy and that, it's all about an individual effort to get things done. The focus on food charity, which really looks at charitable solutions to address systemic needs, and then good versus bad foods, which we will talk about in more detail. So next slide, please. And I might have put some of these slides out of order, so apologies if I did that. But nope, we'll just stay where we are. But I just want to, again, reinforce that what these narratives focus on is that they really emphasize individual actions and behaviors instead of fixing systems and structural issues. And they are all rooted in this unequal distribution of power, ownership, and decision-making. So let's talk a little bit about communities can't take care of themselves, because this is something I mentioned in my opening that my background was in philanthropy. And I think I probably spoke about this a little bit the last time, but within communities can't take care of themselves, it's rooted in this belief that low income and or BIPOC communities, so those aren't necessarily one and the same, and individuals can't provide or make decisions for themselves. So there's this assumption that people can't do and assumes some kind of outside force needs to come in and help them. And what communities can't take care of themselves is rooted in is these negative racial and class stereotypes that dictate who has power and has the ability to make decisions in food policy and programming. And this is really something important to think about, because it's one of the questions I ask all the time is, well, who's making decisions for whom and why? And whose opinion is valid or validated, and why is that the case? Like, who's deciding whose opinion matters, or who's deciding whose solution matters? And what happens within communities can't take care of themselves, again, are a lot of times these external organizations prescribe solutions. So you're making up a solution for a community without consulting them, or even if you are consulting them, a lot of times it's you have a community meeting where folks may or may not show up, may or may not have the time to show up. But a lot of times those community meetings are designed to kind of rubber stamp some recommendations that have already been brought in from the outside, because there's this assumption that whatever organization it is that's been brought in knows better than community members. And whatever community-led solutions are offered, those are often ignored. Next slide, please. So this example is one that I funded over and over again because it was part of what's termed best practice at the time, which were these mobile produce markets. And so this was when I was working in philanthropy. The majority of the relationships that I had working in philanthropy were with high capacity, white-led organizations who were working on behalf of Black and Brown communities. What would happen would be that I would make a grant to a white-led organization, which would build the capacity and the asset of that institution. And it didn't ever directly invest in the community. And so, I think we went into this a little bit in depth into this narrative the last time, but there's so much that reinforces this narrative. And I share this example of the work that I did in philanthropy because probably you're having to fill out grant applications all the time. And as we think about the systems that are reinforcing, who's making decisions for whom, I will, be very transparent that the grant applications that I put out had terms like subject matter experts, like who was being consulted to create this initiative. It had terms like target audience. So who is this work being targeted at? And then the way the questions are framed center the ideas and the ideals of individuals external to the issue that are proposing solutions, and then resources directed to these white-led institutions to solve these issues, as opposed to supporting existing community-led solutions that can really start to build wealth and ownership in a community. Because the questions that are asking, when community is the target audience, it absolutely implies that they don't have the expertise needed to solve their own issues. A lot of times what's happening is the capacity, the dollars, and the connections, the support is not there for community leaders to solve their own issues, because all of that support and power is being held external to the community. Next slide, please. So the good versus bad foods narrative came up time and time again. And what the good versus bad food narrative speaks to is treating white dominant culture as the default for deciding what foods are good or bad. We think about the dietary guidelines. We think about like historically the food pyramid, which removes. And so these frameworks essentially remove culturally appropriate foods from the discourse. And they also insinuate that some foods are bad because of these racial biases or cultural biases. And by whitening what good food is, also erases the cultural history of BIPOC food traditions, diets, and eating habits. And it really ignores, and again, when I talk about how important history is in terms of understanding the issues we're facing today, thinking about, we talked about the doctrine of discovery when we talked about history the last time, and essentially how not only was indigenous land absolutely taken from indigenous peoples globally, but also indigenous farming practices and foods stripped away from the land. And then also how enslaved peoples from Africa were brought to this land to then create new food and new food systems in this land that was also based on a lot of food traditions from Africa. So there's a lot, there's a book that I would recommend. It's called The Foodie's Guide to Capitalism by Eric Holt Jimenez, and I'll send that as a follow-up, that really goes deep into understanding both globally and here in the US, this role of racism and colonialism in changing eating patterns in terms of who held and who owned food knowledge, and how over the course of time that food knowledge not only has been whitened, but also has been really shifted and changed by global multinational companies owning the food system and pushing out what is deemed as good or bad food. Next slide, please. So I'll give one example of the good versus bad foods. And that goes back to the difference between kale and collard greens, which nutritionally, they're essentially nutritionally equivalent. But within the last, I would say, 20 years, kale has been wildly heralded as this good food, right? Like there's the kale t-shirts that folks wear. There's kale in every smoothie that you can get. There's kale on, kind of every salad bar out there now, but actually like in the salad bar. Collard greens, therefore, are virtually absent from this food discourse. So basically, two nutritionally equal foods, but one being removed from the discourse of what is healthy. And that's really based in this white dominant culture associating collards with poor Southerners or Black Americans, from this negative classist and anti-Black association with collards. And a funny story that I'll tell is, so one of the women who works with us here in Durham, and she is an elder in the Occaneechi Band of the Saponi Nation. She's also an executive chef, and she's also worked in food service for, I think, probably over 40 years. And she just tells a great story about kale and how within the last 20 years, when kale all of a sudden became this, kind of top tier nutrition food, she speaks to her time in food service, where all kale was something that was a garnish on a salad bar or a buffet. And I'm not saying a garnish like that you eat. It was something that was all around the buffet to make the all the other food look pretty. And she spoke to, at the end of the day, you take the kale off this buffet, you put it in a bucket, rinse it off to put it out the next day as another, decoration. So, her association with kale was, who would ever eat kale? It's something you rinse off and, put up for decoration on some kind of salad bar. It's never going to be something that you eat. But then dominant culture really associates kale as, hey, this is a good food, and collards as something that folks should not be eating. Next slide, please. So a third narrative that I wanted to talk about is build it and they'll come. And this kind of goes back to the conversation of the difference between food desert and food apartheid, because build it and they'll come centers the conversation of, okay, well, if there's not food access, then we should just solve food access through this food retail perspective, rather than looking at these historic and structural causes of the access to food. So again, initiatives that I have been involved in, right? Like these healthy retail, getting a grocery store into a community, or how do we create healthy corner stores? How do we do things, in terms of farmers markets and community gardens? None of those, being inherently bad, but as we're thinking about ownership and decision making, what's happening when we're making some of these decisions? And these build it and they'll come decisions, a lot of time focuses on bringing in, a lot of times, large corporate food businesses, rather than investing in existing local avenues of food procurement and wealth building. Another example here of build it and they'll come are a lot of communities have offered lift rides, free lift rides out of community to large retail grocery stores. So again, the dollars that are in community, and can you go back just for a second? Thanks. The dollars that are in community are again going into the pockets of, a Walmart or, a large corporate grocery chain, rather than going into building wealth and ownership right there in the community. And the policies that are around this, which a lot of times are tax breaks, then is more money going into an already well-resourced entity, and communities are having to bear the burden of this. And again, those local solutions and opportunities to build wealth and ownership locally are disregarded in these cases. So next slide, please. So an example is what happens a lot of times through the Healthy Food Financing Initiative. And this was based on the successful state-based food financing that, again, focus on supermarket access as this determinant for food access, and makes the assumption that just supermarket access equals purchase of healthy foods. And again, it focuses on this concept also that food deserts are something that if you just put an oasis in the middle of a desert, you're going to be fixing the problem, as opposed to understanding why this community has had historic disinvestment and how to start to rebuild wealth from a systems aspect in a community. Also, can the issue with just opening a supermarket, research has shown that it doesn't result in people buying healthier foods. It does, people do shop at these grocery stores, but there's no evidence to show that it results in people buying healthier foods or that it creates a substantive change in these communities. Next slide, please. So back to kind of what do all of these narratives have in common? These narratives pathologize individuals. They make the assumption that those directly impacted don't know that they're directly impacted, don't have what they need in terms of an idea about what they want to do to address the situation that they're currently in. And then it centers power, it centers ownership, and it centers decision-making in organizations that have predominantly held power, which are predominantly white, external, larger, higher capacity organizations. What the narratives also do is they operationalize these assumptions. So going back to what I perpetuated when I was working in philanthropy, I was assuming that there was a target audience that needed help with the questions that I asked, and that there were external subject matter experts who somehow knew better, and that they needed to come in and fix things, or a grocery store needed to be brought in to serve a community. And then what happens, so healthy food financing is a federal funding stream. Philanthropy, there's so many different foundations. There's billions of philanthropic dollars that are out there, and both, federal government, state and local government, philanthropic, all of these systems reinforce and reward. There's these structures and systems that reinforce and reward the white narratives that we're used to operating in. Next slide, please. And what happens when all of this is being reinforced, kind of going back to those ideas of power, going back to the idea of those qualities of white supremacy culture and that historic framework of structural racism, basically that continues to reinforce those who are already in power to employ these white supremacy culture narratives. And the power mechanism shows up in paternalism. I mean, paternalism is about deciding for others. And the way it shows up again, you have leadership on initiatives where people who aren't directly impacted by the decisions are making the decision. Paternalism also shows up in charity models. So making decisions to give clothes to people, food to people. And this is not to say that we should not clothe and feed people. There's immediate need. But if we're looking for long-term systemic solutions, we do not have any data to show that charity solves these issues. It does kind of create a stopgap measure. And paternalism, again, creates those target groups and maintains this hierarchy. Another power mechanism is meritocracy. And that's really based in this belief that some groups are deserving of what they have, and other groups are deserving of not having things. And that's truly based on these ahistorical narratives. If you think about, again, the concept of the doctrine of discovery, which is all rooted in an ahistorical narrative that indigenous peoples were inhuman and that therefore colonizers could come in and claim their land. That's all based in a meritocracy belief that those colonizers had the right to that land. Things showing up today over and over, we value education-based expertise. So think about anything where you have to fill out why I might be qualified for something, or a job application, or who might be leading a project. You have to talk about education-based expertise. It's not about directly impacted experience. And then a lot of times funding, again, is based on existing capacity. So well-resourced organizations continue to get resourced. And all of this continues to just maintain these power imbalances. And then a big part of this is control. So when those organizations get resourced and then are working on behalf of other organizations, they set up stringent requirements for what those organizations can and can't do, or those people can and can't do. The funding a lot of times is contingent upon success, and a lot of times success can't happen in the context of the narrow scope of the project. Control also shows up in symbolic gestures. So a lot of things that show up in a charity model are this benevolence. Oh, we will give you, this, $500 as a symbol of our relationship. But the $500, one, requires a lot of gratitude, maintains a power imbalance, and a lot of times comes with reporting structures or requirements on what those dollars can be used for. So these are ways that power is maintained, thinking about who's making decisions for whom, the idea that you're deserving to make these decisions, and you're using these decisions to control what's happening. Next slide, please. So here's the good part. The good part is the what's next, because what's next is what we're all trying to do already. We're trying to figure out, okay, what have we been doing? Why is that so almost easy to do, right? So the systems continue to reinforce how we're doing it. So it's hard to swim upstream. It's hard to push against what the system is set up to allow us to do. So next slide, please. So we want to talk about, how do we move towards food justice? So food justice is this struggle against racism. It's this struggle against exploitation, and it's this struggle against the oppression that is already taking place within the food system. And food justice looks at addressing inequality's root causes, both within and beyond the food chain. So our food system exists within more of our political and economic systems. So we have to understand the political and economic systems to understand the root cause issues within our food system. So as we're thinking about food justice, and as we're thinking about, okay, how do we align what we can do and what we want to move to be able to do towards food justice? One, food justice is movement oriented. So it's all about what are these alternative spaces for production, processing, distribution that is based within communities that have been historically excluded from decision-making and power over the food system. So who has not had power, and how do we shift and share power to be working in support of communities as the decision makers? Next slide, please. So going back to the slide that we had before, talking about paternalism, meritocracy, and control, what justice is about how do we transfer that power? How do we directly address and correct these power imbalances? Which doesn't mean all of a sudden, if you've been working in an organization that has typically had power, these organizations are never going to not have power in our lifetimes. But we can't think of this as a zero-sum game. So it's not as if, oh, if I give you some of my power, now I have no power. It's about how do we reorient ourselves to understand what supportive and connective power shifting looks like. So how do we move from this paternalistic idea to more of the empowerment idea? How do we move from this meritocracy idea where, we're deserving of the power that we have, to understand the context in which folks are living and operating and develop a relationship in that space? And then how do we also move from needing to control what's happening to trusting and supporting? Next slide, please. So just to go into this in a little bit more detail, and this is the theoretical part, and I'll talk in just a moment about more applicable parts. But justice really is changing, as I've said probably 50 times already. Who's making the decisions and who's controlling the resources? And this is really how we employ these mechanisms of justice, how we think about empowerment, how we think about context and relationship, and how we think about trust. So when we're thinking about empowerment, thinking about who is in leadership and how do we make sure to center leadership of folks that are directly impacted by the decisions. Also within empowerment, how do we think about models that don't just offer services, but actually build wealth and ownership in communities? And then also, how do we think about reparative funding models? So, I'll go back to philanthropy because that's really kind of the depth of my history. But still today, less than 7% of all philanthropic giving goes to organizations led by and accountable to communities of color. And so there is still predominantly more than 90% of funding that's going to predominantly white organizations. So reparative means, yeah, we've got to make a major shift about who's getting funded and how. Then thinking about that context and relationship, I always recommend, reading and thinking about as much history as possible, because understanding history allows you to understand how these systems have been built. And you can't pull one thing out because we do live and work in intersectional systems. So we have to understand how what we're doing and how the communities in which we're working are working also in this historical context. And that there is experience-based expertise that when paired with education-based expertise, we can really do some rock star things together. So that's that relationship piece, is how do we get to understand the systems in which we're operating, the history that has brought us here, and how to kind of leverage relationships so that we can now, instead of working on behalf of organizations and communities, be working in support of those. And then really trust. And the conversations that I've been having within the philanthropic community and within the academic community is how do we start to talk about trust as an outcome? Right now, there's very few things that really pay for how you can build trust. You need time, you need space, you need things where the pressure is off to really build that trust. And it's only through trust that you can start to have this power transfer. So that context, trust, context and relationship all kind of combine in terms of how we can start to create food justice. Next slide, please. So I'll give two examples. During COVID, we at the World Food Policy Center were asked to come up with a resilient strategy for North Carolina's food system. And I will, again, send the link as a follow-up, because what our food strategy came up with was some critical action recommendations. So this process was led by a coalition of community leaders from across North Carolina who were all boots on the ground doing this work. And all of these recommendations spoke specifically to how can we shift power and decision making into our community leadership. And so The recommendations that came out were about creating a BIPOC-led and community accountable food justice network. I think the last time I spoke a little bit about equitable food-oriented development, but I can also send that as a follow-up resource. That's a national network that's all about community-led and community accountable solutions to grow collective wealth through food. We talked about, we made recommendations on developing community participatory grant funding. We created a statewide tribal food sovereignty fund. And so that actually, the tribal food sovereignty fund was actually one of these recommendations that made it into our state budget. All the others we're still working on, creating a Black Food and Farm Advocacy Network and a Black Food and Agriculture Fund. Then creating an agricultural worker advocacy fund and expanding an existing agriculture workforce development network. And how do we bring funders into this? So how do we create a food justice learning network for North Carolina funders? So these were all critical actions that came as a result of this resilience strategy that I can send as a follow-up. Next slide, please. And an example of this at the federal level is a new investment, relatively new. So this happened in the fall of last year through the Food and Nutrition Service on the food distribution program on Indian reservations. So this is really about how choice can be made within tribal lands so that they can source food from tribal owners, they can source food from tribal communities to start to circulate these federal dollars within tribal communities, as opposed to, what has always happened, which is external food being brought in to tribal lands that is not meeting cultural needs. It's also not building any wealth in tribal communities. So it's significant that there's recognition from the USDA level on this way to shift power and decision making, and recognizing all of this is slow. This is all, kind of first steps. Folks are still trying to figure out how to build something that has never existed in the history of our country. But I just really appreciate all of you having an interest in trying to figure out how to do this. So I know we don't have that much time for questions, but I'm glad to open it up to see if folks have any questions. Yeah, can you explain a bit what is meant by good versus bad foods? So a lot of times in nutrition education or in terms of just narratives around what you should eat and what you shouldn't eat, and now I am not a nutritionist, so I think we probably have a lot of folks with nutrition degrees who are probably on the call. And so there's a lot in nutrition and nutrition education, and historically, we have evolved to start to talk about, like, how do you prepare culturally relevant foods in a healthier way? But a lot of the rooting of what was deemed good was food that came from more of this kind of white-centric framework, as opposed to traditional cultural foods that was not named, let's say, in any kind of dietary guidelines or regulations. I don't know if that was helpful on that, Jonathan.
Yeah, thanks. And your earlier explanation on kale and
okay,
collard greens was right on it. Thanks.
Okay, great. Sorry, I'm trying to read. It's interesting that many of the narratives focus on the individual's responsibility. So, Corinne, I'm not quite sure I'm understanding your question. So mention the individuals. So communities can't help themselves is not based on the idea. Communities can't help themselves is based on the assumption that individuals can't take care of their needs, not the reality that communities can't take care of their needs. So I'm not quite sure I'm understanding the question, or if there's something I need to offer more there.
Yeah, no, I was just kind of making a comment. I was just kind of reflecting on these narratives and how a lot of them that you talked about were based on the assumption that individuals should, like you said, pick themselves up by their bootstraps and are in control of their health outcomes or of sort of the, social circumstances around them, in that very individualistic kind of approach. And I was just kind of commenting that it was interesting that those narratives exist and that, like, a lot of the ones that you talked about are based on that idea, but then there's also this communities can't help themselves idea that individuals aren't capable of, like, developing their own solutions and therefore need these, external experts and organizations or people to come in that know what's best. And like you mentioned with the mobile food pantry. And so I'm just kind of reflecting on, like, how contradictory that is of having an idea that individuals should do things for themselves, and then also this, like, notion that individuals are not capable of doing things for themselves. I don't know. I just was kind of, like, reflecting on how contradictory and very dangerous both of those narratives are.
Yeah, Naima?
Hey, Jen, good to see you. Thanks for being here again. Yeah, I have kind of a reflection and I think a question, as I am listening to your presentation and just reflecting on the concept of food justice, which I think that most of the people on this call would consider pretty central to our approach and our values related to food nutrition security. And I think, to me, one of the things that I find so sort of meaningfully different about the concept of justice is that it holds sort of simultaneously the importance of centering the now and the future, but also holistically acknowledges that there's some component of redressing past injustices as well. And so one thing that I've just, and this is just kind of a personal, professional conundrum that I find myself in. So I know there's no easy answer to this, but, we're very bound in so many ways in the public sector by federal funding mechanisms. And I think this idea of really exploring what reparative frameworks look like from a funding standpoint seems really possible in the philanthropic world. And we're starting to see a lot of examples of that. We're working with this really exciting group from Chicago that's coming in and wanting to really fund a lot of food projects, without asking people to jump through hoops and, fill out these insanely burdensome grant applications and things like that. I feel like we're still so far away from that when it comes to the way that we consider federal funding frameworks. And even though there's a lot of opportunities that the USDA is putting out that are, I think, centered in equity, I think it's still pretty far away from what I would say being focused on justice and reparative frameworks. So I don't know, I guess I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that. And if you think we're moving in the right direction on the federal landscape, and just if you have any thoughts that you'd like to share with us on that.
Yeah, and I think that's a great question and a great statement, because it's slow. And the fact that we're having to undo, 400 plus years of history and restart it. So thinking that in the 3-year grant cycle you might have that you're going to be able to, like, achieve justice or liberation is, challenging for everyone, right? It creates this conundrum of, why can't I do more? And so, while I don't support the idea let me just be complacent about not pushing, also, you have to hold both truths of celebrating what you're able to get to, and understanding that where we have to go is very, very far. And I will say, I mean, I was with folks at the Sustainable Funders meeting from USDA who really are like stating how different things are within the federal government now and how much they're trying to move. Also understanding that you never know administration to administration, how much you're going to be able to push. And so the reality of our work, whether you're working on federal and state, is that you are going to have limitations. So the more that dollars can go to support community leadership, the more decision making can be made in relationship with community leadership. It's all about that relationship build now that you can do under the parameters of what you have to work with, and building that relationship. Folks understand like the limitations, and they'll continue to push us, which is kind of what we want. So standing in it is kind of where you have to be, and I'm glad to have further conversations more. It's a lot to unpack. Well, I've kept everybody over 2 minutes, and I know everybody's probably having to go to the bathroom or get one drink of water before you jump on your next Zoom or Teams meeting. But thank you again for having me here. Any way that I can support moving forward, I'm glad to do that. And just thank you everybody on the call for your interest in your work. It's hard work, and thank you for staying in it.
Thank you for joining us, Jen. We greatly appreciate it. As a reminder to everyone, we did record this, and it will be up on our website by the end of next week. So please check them out. When this one is uploaded, I will send an email out to the network alerting you guys all of both of them. Both of those web pages will include and continue to include any resources that Jen shares with us or mentioned in this presentation. I will have them all linked, and more information about Jen and where you can contact her. So thank you all for joining us today. I hope you enjoy the rest of your week.